Frankie,
Ian,
what's up,
how are
bro?
you? You look great. You look blue shirt, looking good,
Hey
buddy.
man, I'm doing my best. Your hair's starting to grow out really nice and thick.
I got to live up to the artwork on that caricature. I, I
Yeah,
I literally have that cut out and pasted on my mirror now, and that's what I'm going with.
that cartoon artist just nailed your hair. It's just perfect hair and beard.
Yeah, the best thing about that is I showed that to my family, and they were like, "Frank, you look like you're bald, and how come your steak's half done and Ian's just drinking?" This is another podcast episode. It's like take control of the things you want to make sure you have control over.
So Frank and I are talking about our logo for this podcast because we're big time enough where we hired an artist on Upwork to create a cartoon. And honestly, that is the best example to start off the topic of this. So this poor guy, we hired him for like $200 to draw, pretty much a caricature like you would see, you could get at like Disney World, with your kids, of you playing sports, or football or something, and big cartoon heads. And this guy must have done 16 drafts. It starts off where it doesn't look a lot like us. And then we keep poking, keep picking at it a little bit. Frank doesn't have that much hair on his arms. He's got my eye color wrong. My nose doesn't look like that. Frank's like, is our foreheads really that big? I'm like, yes, but I'm going to tell him to bring it down a little anyway. Literally, long story short, I think we have like 13 renditions of our logo to go back to, but the new one is perfect, and we both look 22 years old and really handsome.
That's right. That's right. You don't look like Mitt Romney or Colin Cowherd, which is both in the early renditions. You're like, damn it, I don't look like this.
My first comment to the guy was, "This is a really nice drawing. I'm just not sure it's of us." And he was like, "Okay, I get it. I'll do better." So this podcast, we are talking about, I think, something that plagues anyone in any career, but definitely startup owners. But me as always, as a manager and as a creative now, as someone who writes and creates videos, I struggle with this. Your line is done as the new perfect. And I think what we're talking about here really is perfectionism, which we'll get into it. We disagree a little on some things, but I look at it as also procrastination. And we'll talk a little about the difference between perfectionism and procrastination. And what really kicked us off talking about this, Frank and I are both aficionados of 80s hair bands.
Oh yeah.
That's the era that we grew up in. And GNR, Guns N' Roses, is one band that we share a special affinity for. Anyone that grew up in the 80s, I would question anyone who was not a fan of Appetite for Destruction. And it's a fascinating album.
If you grew up in the 80s and you are not a fan of Guns N' Roses, like, you are probably a Russian spy.
You're suspect KGB. There's no doubt about it. You're suspect KGB if you don't like Appetite for Destruction. So it's fascinating, that album. If you hear any of the band members, Axl / any of them, Duff, if you hear them talk about it, to the point where when you hear them talk about it, it's hard to believe, because the songs on that album are so iconic and so good. And yet when they talk about making the songs, you would think that it was a first take. All of them, they say they kind of wrote them and produced them and recorded them in 3-4 hours. That's how they would do a song back then. And Sweet Child of Mine, the way that started, Slash was really just doing a little practice exercise, just kind of warming up. He was screwing around with Duff in their apartment, and Axl heard it. He heard the main riff, which is, probably a top 10 guitar riff of all time, Sweet Child of Mine, the lead guitar. And he said, "Hey, play that again. I want to hear it." And so he's like, "It's just a warm up." He's just doing a warm up. And he said, "I want to hear it again." And he brought over a poem that he had written to his girlfriend at the time, which would become the lyrics to Sweet Child of Mine. So Axl, instead of reading the poem, started singing the words to that poem to Slash's riff. And the beauty of this song is, then they got into the studio. They're like, "We got to record this. It's good." Slash never liked it, because Slash thought they didn't put a lot of time into it. It was too too much of a ballad. He wasn't into rock ballads. He thought it was weak for the concept of GNR. But they get to the studio and they record it, and it's only like a minute and a half, and they needed a 3-minute song. And so they had to come up with new lyrics, and they had to come up with new riffs into this song. And so that's when Axl started singing along, "Where Do We Go Now?" And he just, instead of singing, he would just start singing, "Where do we go now?" And he was doing that over and over to where Slash was like, "That's pretty good. Let's just leave that." And if you look at the lyrics, he says, "Where do we go now?" 17 times. It's like filler in a crab cake to finish the song. And everyone in the band except Axl, because Axl liked it because it was a poem to his girlfriend. Slash didn't even want to put it on the album, thought it was garbage, didn't think it would ever do anything. And Sweet Child of Mine ended up being their first hit. Their first song they released was Welcome to the Jungle, but it didn't do well. And they did put out Sweet Child of Mine because the label thought it would do well, and it killed it. It's their best seller, to the point where they then went back out and put Welcome to the Jungle out after Sweet Child of Mine a second time. And the second time Welcome to the Jungle hit, but the first time it did not hit. People didn't like it. And I think this is just a great example of, one, you never know what's going to be a hit. If you're creative at all, if you're building a business, if you're building products, if you're a writer, you just don't know. You don't know what the hits are going to be.
And it's usually the opposite of what you think it's going to be. Most people will tell you this one's a surefire hit and you have no idea. And it's exactly the opposite. You're like, it's a throwaway and it's a smash.
Yeah. And I think it's the same with anything. Frank has a real estate business. I bet you have some deals that you were sure were going to kill it and you lost your ass on it. And you've had some deals that you were like, this one's marginal, I'll throw it in. And it just absolutely made you a fortune.
The curse of death early in our career, it's no longer this way, but early in my career, 10, 12 years ago, whenever I projected something as a $100,000 profit deal, we lost money. So I go into like, we can't lose. We're going to make $100,000. And at the end, I got to write a check.
Yeah. And think about all the people that we've interviewed and hired. How many times have you hired someone you're so excited, you're like, can't miss. This is terrible. Absolute, we've crushed it. What a great hire. And they turn out to be a maniac within like a month. You're like, that was an awful hire.
And on the opposite side, one of our best salespeople, we had a recruiter. He's no longer with us. He sent me an email and he goes, "This guy's not a hire for us." I was like, "Awesome. Bring him in. If you don't like him, I want him." And he's incredible.
So, that story with Guns N' Roses, just, you don't know what's going to be a hit. And so, put it out, but you can't be perfect. They could have sat on that song for 2 years trying to get the perfect third stanza, which there is no third stanza. The third stanza is "Where do we go now?" And I. That's all he does. After that, they didn't. They just released it, and they let the market decide whether it was a good decision to release it. And it turned out to be their best decision to release it.
On the opposite side, right? So, like, this comes down to professionalism. It comes down to being on heroin, which we aren't. They were during these stretches of time, which is a big part of it. But if we're going to take a business lesson from this, the thing you have to look at is they were living in a crappy apartment. There was drugs and booze, and they were scrappy, and they were hungry, and they hadn't made it, and they were broke, and they took a chance. 2 decades later, 2.5 decades later, they finally released Chinese Democracy, and it's garbage. It's got like arrangements from orchestras. It's got all this other stuff. It is like, I've listened to it all the way through, I think once. It's overproduced. It isn't relevant. It doesn't get you, it gets nothing out of you. Where Sweet Child of Mine still stops me in my tracks and I get fired up to hear that song, even though I've listened to it thousands of times by this point in my life, because it's relevant, it's quick, like you can think of where you were, it speaks to you. We didn't talk about this in prep, and I want to kind of surprise you with this. I'm going to bring this up. The theme of this is done is the new perfect. And done is the new perfect is kind of, you can overthink it, you can procrastinate, or you can just say, screw it. It's close enough. I flip houses. No house is perfect. Guns N' Roses is riding high. Ian talked about their first song tanked. Sweet Child of Mine comes out. They re-released that second song. Here's another thing that we didn't talk about, Ian. Guns N' Roses Lies is their second album. There's 8 songs. 4 of them are new. 4 of them were just covers from their club day hits. They release it literally in 1988 while all these other songs are going nuts. Was it a perfect album? Was it a studio produced album? No, it sold 5 million copies and 4 of the songs were a decade old. Like like to
That's
that
awesome.
point, it's just like, get it out there, man. We're hot. We're doing well.
Yeah.
Don't cripple yourself with overthinking.
You know, I'm going to go one more on music, but I'm going to go off of rock and roll on this. So the other day on the radio, a song from Ice Cube came on, the radio edit, but it was one of his old ones. It wasn't when he was big. It was right after he left NWA. It was from his like America's Most Wanted. And it came on, and my son loves old school hip hop. So don't judge me as a dad. But he loves it. And he was like, "Who is this?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's Ice Cube." He goes, "His voice is awesome, Dad. He's a great rapper." And I'm listening to the song, and I remember, like, it brought back a flood of memories because I loved NWA, Ice Cube, all that. But what was fascinating, Frank, is that song is so underproduced. It's just like a bass line and Cube's voice, and it's raw. He's angry. He's upset with NWA because they screwed him out of a bunch of money. And I went back and I watched the movie on NWA and how all of that happened.
Straight Outta Compton.
Straight Outta Compton. I went back and watched it, and I watched the scene of when he left and when he went out and produced America's Most Wanted. He did it in like no time, like in lightning. And he did it when he was raw, when he was emotional, when he was upset. He just wrote a bunch of lyrics with pencil and just went out, got in a studio with, you know, you kind of picture him like a synthesizer, and he just went out and crushed those guys. But as a kid listening to it, and even now listening to it now, it's his voice. He's emotional. He's enthused, and it's good stuff. It is really, really good music, but he just put it out because he wanted people to know that he was talented and he could do it without the band. And it's just a very raw, unproduced kind of thing, you know, the opposite of Chinese Democracy, more like Appetite for Destruction, where if you listen to those songs, it's a lead guitar, it's a rhythm guitar, it's drums, it's voice. That's it, and it's great.
So I want to finish off the musical analogies with this, and we can move into the next topic. But when you're young and you're hungry, it's easier to write songs. Like angst-driven songs come from young and hungry. Like there's a famous story of Dee Snider. He's another 80s band guy, right, from Twisted Sister. And everything they did, their best songs are We're Not Gonna Take It and I Wanna Rock. Both songs Ian and I have gotten drunk to and taken our shirts off to like multiple times. Like who hasn't, right?
Who hasn't? Doesn't narrow us down.
Their second album sucked, or the album after that was actually their 4th album, sucked. And he was being interviewed, and he's like, you know, this album is not the same. He goes, I'm an angst-driven guy. I'm sitting at the Ritz. I can't write the same lyrics at the Ritz as I could write when I was broke. So it's hard to capture lightning in a bottle. But I want to go in a different direction with this. If you are really good at your craft and you're really good at your trade, which Ian and I are, which Ice Cube was when he left NWA, he can go out and do something fast. Guns N' Roses had been a club band for almost 10 years, when kind of together and apart, but nearly 10 years when Appetite for Destruction came out. They were good at their craft. One of the greatest songs of all times was written by Roy Orbison. It turned into a movie, Pretty Woman. He wrote that song while his wife was walking away and walking back from the grocery store. It took 20 minutes. So what I want to say kind of in this is it's easier to do things quicker that are incredibly high quality when you've put in the work. And one of the things we're going to talk about at the end of this is the difference between being a pro and being an amateur. When you're a real pro, Cube was a pro when he recorded that first album on his own. Orbison was a pro when he did that incredible song. You can be faster. And when you're in the beginning, and this is something we're going to talk about, you can often overthink things because of your inexperience. And when you have the experience, you don't overthink things as much. You're like, that's just freaking good. I'm just going to screw it up at this point.
Colin Powell has a fascinating concept. He has a rule, the 40-70 rule. So, former Secretary of State, 4-star general, Colin Powell, obviously very accomplished. His concept on the 40-70 rule is, if you don't have 40% of the information that you need, you're probably winging it. So you need to get to 40% of the information. And if you're over 70%, you're probably overthinking it. You don't need that much information. At 70%, you've kind of reached the max of what, and if you think about in a military situation, you can never have 100% intel. If you're going to clear a house, right, Frank, or you're going to clear a neighborhood, or think about the Bin Laden the mission. They didn't have 100% information. They weren't even sure he was in the house. But they were probably at 40%. They were probably in the low end of Powell's rule, the 40-70 rule. But his rule is just, if you're under 40, you're probably being reckless. If you're over 70, you're dragging your feet and you're procrastinating something you should do. And I think that applies to business. It applies to anything creative. It applies to managers, to employees, to people taking chances. Certainly, if I look at all the decisions that I've made, I feel like that holds pretty well, that 40-70.
We had we hosted an event with the Collective Genius, which is a group I work with. Ian knows that he's spoken there before. And we had Jocko Willenick speak last week. He's, motivational speaker, former Navy SEAL, huge podcast audience. And Jocko talked about this. The numbers were incredibly similar. For him, it's anything over 70. It's like it's go time. And if it's the same kind of thing. Like if he's going to delegate something to somebody else, he's like, you get into analysis to paralysis if it's better. If you're roughly around that number, you've got enough. And it comes back to what we talked about a second ago. Do you have the training? Do you have the chops? Have you put in your time? If you've done all that stuff right with 70% knowledge, you can then adjust on the fly as you're in that position. We talked about hiring earlier in this podcast about, you think you got a slam dunk and you don't. Everything in life is a leap of faith. So you've got to do it at a certain percentage, and you have to just be able to let it rip. And procrastination or lack of being able to make a decision comes in later, and you're just crippling yourself because you can never be 100% certain.
And Frank, your business model, your entire business model, you're in the real estate speculation business. Anyone in real estate is in the speculation business, whether they want to admit it or not. You're speculating 100%. Yep. If you're acquiring assets that appreciate or depreciate, you're speculating. So talk a little bit about how the 40-70 rule would apply to just your day-to-day decisions on acquisitions.
So for those of you that are involved in this space, you're going to know this. For those of you that aren't, which is probably a vast majority of the audience, I do what they do on TV. We buy an existing house and we fix it up and sell it. And our exits are a little bit different than what they show you on TV. But if you're going to boil it down, we buy an existing asset and then we repurpose it for sale. So to Ian's point, when I buy a house, I don't understand everything. I don't know what's behind all the walls. I don't know what's buried in the yard. There's always surprises. So if I needed to make sure I knew every single element, I would never buy a house because I can't know every single element. And it's just part of the deal. So what you have to come up to is you have to look at, okay, what can I be certain about? What am I uncertain about? What are the elements I can control? What are the elements I can't control? And then when you look at it at its deepest level, when I was in the very beginning of my business, a bad deal could bankrupt me. We've got 300 plus houses and I have 50 under construction right now. I run into bad deals every 15 minutes. Something wasn't what we thought, but we now have the bandwidth that we can handle it in ways that we weren't able to handle it before. So I am actually probably less risk averse now than I was in the beginning because I have a better team. I'm more creative. We have different exits that we can take that we couldn't take in the past. So,
And you're better at evaluating, right? So you don't take the same risk because you have a team that is good at digging into the details that have cost you money in the past.
as an example to that, I no longer buy houses that were built prior to 1930 that are wood frame. I won't buy it.
Why?
I've lost my ass on enough of those that I know that I can't. They're going to be riddled with termites. If it was built sub 1930, but it's a brick frame, it's got a four-side brick house, I'll buy that house. But those are the little things
How
you
many
kind
of
of
those
look at.
houses did you have to buy before that became a rule?
More than a dozen.
Oh yeah. So it wasn't like the first one you were like, damn it. Like you probably didn't even notice. You were like, oh, termites, this sucks. This is a loser. And you buy another and you buy another. And at some point you start doing the math of when were all these built? And all of a sudden that's a rule.
Success leaves clues. One of the things you have to realize is success leaves clues. And when you start to realize this, you're like, oh, this one had termites. This one had water damage. This one has a rotten floor. This one has a piling that's no good. And then you start to look at it and you're like, all these are framed with wood. Like here, like in 100 years of history, something bad is going to happen to a piece of property. But if it's built of brick, less bad things can happen than if it's built of wood. And then what you have to look at is what else in your life is the difference between built in brick and built in wood? Like, where are the things that are built in brick? Those are the things you invest in. If it was built in wood, I got to pass.
I think a house is such a good analogy. I'm glad you brought this up. As you were talking, so I've had 3 really interesting startup opportunities to invest in my life with people who, people that I knew and I trusted. One of them was one of my best friends from college, started a restaurant business and winery. And it was an interesting concept. And it was at a time when I had just moved to DC and I probably had enough where I could have invested and got involved, but I was buying a house, had other things going on. And everything I knew was don't ever invest in restaurants. They're bad margin. They go belly up. You lose your money. But the one thing I knew about this deal was the guy starting it was just made from my kind of stock. He was just, he's a hard worker. He's passionate. He is smart as hell. And he's absolutely outgoing. He's a great marketer, high energy. Long story short, I didn't invest in it. And, here we are 20 years later and it's a $700 million business and I missed it. And that, to me, the foundation, that was a brick foundation. The foundation was the owner. It was the startup, was the person starting it because it was just an idea. And I made a different decision on a technology startup 8 years ago. And I made 15, 18 times my money on that investment. And I'm about to invest in another deal with the same owner because the foundation is brick. This startup owner, I know what he's made of. I know how smart he is. And I know if I'm going to lose money, it is not going to be from integrity. It is not going to be from a lack of hard work or focus. It's not going to be because of someone's pride getting in the way of asking for help. I know that's the kind of deal I would lose money on. And I feel very good about the upside. And
You're on the right side of it. Even if you lose money on that deal, you're on the right side of it. You invested for nothing is certain, but you're on the right side of the investment. You've got the right person. You've got the right concept. You've got the right period in time, all green shoots. Like if you're looking at 40, 70, you're over 70. And that's when you let it rip.
I'm not even close to 100. It's still a tech startup. It's hardware, it's software, it's a new product. There's patents. There are so many question marks unanswered right now going into this startup. And I'm going to be excited as hell to go back and look at this podcast with you in 10 years and see, oh man, did I get crushed on that? Or did we kill it? Because right now I can tell you in the pit of my stomach, I'm nervous. It's a big investment that I'm throwing into this thing and I'm kind of diving in as an equity partner. But I feel like there are enough bases covered that the question marks I have, I think your two questions are great. What can I be certain of? What can I not be certain of? I think I've done enough homework where I'm well over 70% that if I lose money, I'm not going to go back and say, you missed some really obvious stuff. It's just going to be, the market wasn't as excited as we thought, or we just didn't execute right. That's going to be it.
This is going to get slightly off topic, but I think it's worth bringing up here for this reason. You also need to understand where you are in your life when you're making these decisions. The restaurant you missed out on, you were 15, 20 years younger. You didn't have the money. You didn't have the security. You weren't in the same place. It's like, I shouldn't take this chance, right? But now things are different and you're like, okay, I can take this chance. It comes from two things. It comes from, number one, where you are in life and your level of savings, but it also comes from sharpening your skills and honing your craft. Ice Cube could make that album because he was a badass and he was ready. Mm-hmm. You can make this decision because you've made a lot of other decisions. You haven't made this decision, but you've made a lot of other decisions. So it gets easier to put out the final product. It gets better to say, you know what, done is the new perfect because I've done enough of this where I know it's quality and I know I'm making a good decision. Is it going to work? I don't know, but it's a good decision and it gets easier. If you've progressed properly, if you've done this right, as a 25-year-old versus a 45-year-old, you should have more angst at 25. You don't have the experience, you don't have the net worth, you don't have any of that. But if you've paid attention at 45, success has led to clues, and you're like, you know what, this is good. And you might have missed it before, but now you don't have to miss it.
Yeah, you do this for a living, acquire properties, but at some point you had to acquire your first resi properties. Cava had to go out and buy its first deals and try to make its first deals. But I bet before you did that, you probably looked at a lot first and dragged your feet on some where finally you had to say, you know what, either I have a business or I don't have a business, but I can't just keep looking at deals. You don't have a business until you take some risk.
Yeah. And to be completely honest with you, like buying a house was easy for me because I had done that a bunch of times at NVR. But like the first time I ever assigned a house, I was scared to death. I ended up making $2,700 and I was positive every time there was a siren in the background, I thought they were coming for me. Like I knew I was going to get arrested. Like I had done $1 billion worth of real estate. And this little $2,700 deal was going to fucking cripple me. And I was going to jail for the rest of my life. And I was going to be in stripes. And I was like, but I was scared. But what happened was I said, okay, I am scared, but I have the fundamentals. I know what I'm doing. I couldn't afford an attorney back then, so I just read everything myself, and I'm like, I don't think I'm doing anything illegal. I think everything I'm being told, this works. I got to let it rip. And you know what happened? I did the deal. And then now, like this month, we're going to do over $400,000 of that kind of deal. But had I not done that first deal for $2,700 when I couldn't sleep for a week because I knew I was going to jail, I never would have gotten here. But that's the stuff that you got to take those steps.
Yeah, that's, when I left NBR, the first thing I was focused on was acquiring commercial real estate. And I knew the exact product I wanted. I wanted to be an industrial. I wanted one tenant. I wanted something that was triple net and had a 10, 15 year lease on it. Frankie, I probably looked at 150, 200 of those deals, realtors calling me all over. I called them all to get on these lists and to get off lists. And people call me all the time. And I just kept saying no. And really, I was saying no to some good deals. And at some point I had to tell myself, no one's going to call you anymore if you won't do it. Like you're either doing this or you're not doing it, but you're not going to learn and you're not going to find the perfect deal. Because if it was a perfect deal, why would you know about it? Someone else already did it. There's going to be some hair on something you do. And if you don't take the risk, you're never going to be in this deal. That's how I'm going to have to learn. So I had to close the deal. And once I closed the deal, I relaxed on the next one. It wasn't as scary.
And I remember you in that process of buying that first deal, right? Like you were driving through Richmond to get down there because it's in Georgia, and you're like, maybe I'll stop, maybe we'll talk. And I was hoping to get in the car with you so we could both drive down and have a couple of days together and just talk about deals. But I remember where I was, and you were asking me questions about like, what do you consider? I've thought about this. What are the risks? And I was in a house that we were flipping, and I sat on the stoop. It was like a nice fall day, and I remember talking to you for a while. And it was the same things I felt when I first started. They were exactly the same. But we both took that step because we'd done enough research. We had enough of the answers. We were way closer to 70 than we were to 40. And what all this really boils down to is self-belief. Like, am I making a good decision? Can I do it? And like, when you do a deal on your own, you've got to believe in yourself. Ice Cube knew when he got in the studio, shit was going to happen. That comes down to personal belief. You're going to invest in this restaurant. You're going to invest in this tech startup. You can control a little bit of it, but some of it is, does that person have that self-belief? Do they know they got the goods? And that's part of the calculus that you have to look at. So it really comes down in a lot of instances, your self-confidence or the self-confidence of the person who you're betting on.
Yeah.
Can they do it?
So Frank and I did a very interesting and creative deal together at the end of 2019. And it's probably worth unwrapping that from both of our perspectives, because it was we're way out there on risk and in multiple fronts and what we had to do. And we certainly didn't have enough time to vet it to 100%, but I think we got to 70, and it certainly wasn't below 40. So I think it would meet Powell's 40-70, but maybe Frank, just talk about how that deal started and why you had to bring me in at the end of last year in the first place.
So we buy real estate and we repurpose it. Like I said earlier, we had bought a 30-unit package beginning of 2018, and it got written up in the local business paper. And someone who owned a bunch of units, which ultimately became 75, called us. And they brought us this deal, and my team analyzed it. And we analyzed it for like 9 months. And we didn't analyze it for 9 months because we couldn't come up with a decision. We had to get to the right number. And we got them all the way whittled down to a number that really, really, really made sense. But then I looked at it with my team, and we were like, the way that we need to do this is we need some capital. We're going to kind of get complicated here on banking terms, but instead of just debt, we also need an equity partner. The equity partner gives us money in the bank that gives us the liquidity to do the deal. So I thought about this deal, and I thought about Ian's deals with his service and collision centers, and I was like, he's the right guy for this. He would comprehend it. He would know it. Ian writes for Forbes. He's really good at summarizing things. So I knew that he could put together something that I couldn't in how to build this deal. So we had worked on it for about 9 months. Ian knew that I am a strong operator who works hard, who has a lot of integrity, the same things he said earlier about the tech startup. And in probably 4 hours of conversation, maybe less, you felt comfortable enough to pitch this. And I'll stop there, and I'll kind of ask you, like, where do you want to pick it up from here?
So what it came down to is Frank needed to talk to me because it was a very large deal, and Frank had multiple large deals going on at the same time. You had multiple tranches of projects that you were working on, and this was a whale that was in the middle of a lot of other whales that you had going on. This was a very good year for Frank. And so to make it work with the debt, he needed private capital, of which I couldn't provide all of it. So we needed to raise some capital. And he needed an operator to step back from it, just the way this deal works. So there were 75 properties, and Frank felt relatively assured that he could give a great return to investors. So my role was really going out and raising some money, either doing as much of it with myself as I could, or raising money. So for me, not only did I need to be comfortable with Frank, that's an easy one. I've invested with Frank before. I needed to be comfortable enough with Frank's deal to call my friends and ask them for money. So it was a little bit of a difficult decision for me, just because I had I had to answer to myself, was the return worth it for me to stress out about making other friends? Like, you start to get into derivatives, right, off of farther from it. But to me, it comes right back to what Frank said. The foundation was good. It was a brick foundation. I believe in Frank's company. I know his company is strong. I believe in Frank's integrity. I know Frank wouldn't call me out of greed, just to make some money, knowing that he could lose me a bunch of money and he'd keep it. I just kind of knew that no matter what would happen, Frank would try to find every avenue he could to make it work. And so my decision was to go call a bunch of my friends and ask for money, raise money, and to put my name on an LLC as a manager and working with Frank on it, knowing that I was going to lean on his people to do all of the work. And so I think for both of us, it was very much a 40-70 type of a deal, but closer to the 70. And looking back on it, there are some, 75 houses. Frank vetted them as best he could. Some of the deals we've absolutely killed our pro forma on. We've, we thought we'd get 30% and we're making 60-70%. Some of them doubled. And some of them we've gotten killed. Just a month ago, Frank, you and I were going back and forth. I'm like, why isn't the projected return higher? And you're like, honestly, we took a bath on a few of these. I didn't see them as bad as they could be. But that's where I think quantity trumps quality in most things. When you have 75, if he'd asked me to just get involved in one house and that house had termites or was a problem, we'd have lost. We'd have had all our eggs in one basket. But with 75 houses, you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. So the quantity, I think, is what has helped us on this, Frank. But from my decision perspective, just like yours, I had enough information that the foundation of the investment was solid, that it made a lot of sense for me to get involved and to also get others involved that I respected and trusted.
And I don't know if you remember this, but during this deal, and like we were doing kind of a pitch video for the people that we ultimately took this to, and done is the new perfect. This was the pitch. I believe in the operator. I believe in the market. I believe in the deals. And not only do I believe in those deals, this is an area where these people are currently incredibly proficient. Like, it's Richmond where I live. It's the type of assets we own. I own stuff on the same streets already. So when you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, do I want to let this just control me forever or not? Those were some of the decisions. Like, here it is in a box on why.
And I think, Frank, real quick, I'll jump in on that. One other thing that, as I was talking to investors, this was a very big deal. This was a, $5.5 million worth of homes that were looking for an exit close to $9 million. This was a big risk. This was a stressful situation. That I didn't just say I believe in Frank because it's 75 deals. Frank is good. Frank is not good enough to do all of it himself because you have 75 tenants. You have to collect rent. If someone quits paying rent, you have to get them out, find a new tenant. You have to work with permits. You have to work with the city. What I believed in, and knowing Frank well enough, Frank has a very good team. If Frank would have said, I'm going to do all this myself, Ian, I won't let you down, I would have been hesitant, Frank, if you would have said that. Like, look, I'm going to keep this separate from my company, but I know he has Eddie. I know he has Cindy. I know he has a property management arm. I knew the people you would have in the middle technically on this deal, and that made me feel comfortable that you had the capacity to take on something that big, and I sold that to the people that, as I raised the money. And that deal is going to do very well for everyone who's been involved in it.
That's right. And along the way, we've had to adjust. We've had to course correct. We've had to change things. COVID happens. We can't collect rent. We can't evict people. But we've got enough leeway. This is something I think is really critical to talk about right here as we're kind of wrapping this thing up. Novices fall in love with a deal. And the reason you fall in love with the deal is because you don't have other deals. And the difference between a novice and a pro knows more deals are coming around the corner. I can generate leads. I know I can say no to something because I know I can generate leads. That makes me more discretionary. Even though I do way more, I mean, we do 300-400 deals a year, but I say no to so much. I've seen so many things. I can say, I do not need to procrastinate. I can go because of all of these things. And I can also say, I can pass because another thing's coming around the corner.
You know, we're leaning on real estate, but I think all decisions out of creativity come down to this. And I'm a writer. I enjoy writing. The first article I ever wrote after I signed a contract with for Forbes, I probably have 25 hours into that article, which is hilarious. For people that don't write, that's absolutely obnoxious. It's probably a 3,000 word article. So it's not the length of it. I edited that thing 40 times because I was so scared to write on Forbes. They let you publish it yourself. There is no editor. So I knew that when I hit this little button that said publish, Ian Mathews was going to have an article on the Forbes website. And if it was bad grammatically, I have this thick grammar book that they give you, and I was checking every sentence. Now I've written 50 articles for Forbes. I can bang one out in a couple hours. I just did this morning. You know, I can write them much faster. I don't edit them as much. I'm still careful. And it was the same, Frank, when I started writing a newsletter. I have an email list. I take it very serious if someone gives me their email. That's a very personal thing to do, to give someone your email. That means you expect the content to be good. So when I first started sharing my daily writing with my email list, I spent hours on each article every day. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be great. They trusted me. I don't want to bother someone with an email if it's not this light bulb invoking moment that will change their life. Now I write every day, and I probably spend 10, 15 minutes on it. Half of the things I send to my newsletter, I type on my iPhone. I don't send crap. I don't think so, at least. I think I still write good stuff. But the more I write, the more the quantity is, the less I procrastinate and the less perfectionist tendencies I have. Because guess what? If I write a turd, I'm going to write again tomorrow. Maybe they'll like tomorrow's, and they're not going to like everything I write. And the more I write, the more I can experiment, the more I can try something new, the more I can screw around and use a song lyric or use a movie or, you know, do an interview with someone. Whereas if I'm only writing once a month, oh my God, the pressure on that has to be so perfect. Just do it more. Just, you know, do more. And I think that comes down to anything you want to be good at creatively. Do more of it. My son is less stressed about every at bat because he plays on 2 teams and he plays 5 games a week and he has hundreds of plate appearances a year. Whereas he used to play 1 game a week, and it was the World Series Game 7 every time. And the first time he struck out, he was in tears because I'm not going to get another plate appearance for a week. Now it's like, well, another at bat. He's kind of like a major leaguer that strikes out.
Volume gives you an ability to hasten this curve quickly. What Ian and I want you to take away from this is this. Nike. What is Nike? They make shoes and apparel. It wasn't a shoes and apparel company when it started. They could have overthought that name. They might not have a name. They became that name. It's kind of like a logo. You can do your logo 300 times, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is it out there? Is it done? Because once it's out there and it's done, this is what gets to happen. You get feedback. Did people buy the album or did they not buy the album? Do people like it? Let me give them more of that. Because you can overthink everything and you can overproduce it. And Chinese democracy took 20 years. Most of the good songs on Appetite for Destruction took 20 minutes. And we're talking about Appetite for Destruction a hell of a lot more in Chinese democracy because they had their craft and they put it out there and then the world consumed it.
And guess what?
That's what
Chinese democracy probably still would have sucked if they'd have done it in 3 months. But guess what? They wouldn't have gone through 2 decades of stressing and worrying and fighting, and
they would have had 17 or 18 more years to put out something else besides that.
They could have got that feedback right away and been like, okay, what didn't they like about it? Let's go iterate again. They wasted all those years on something that was if you're gonna flop, I think if you're gonna flop fast and go learn from it. Iteration you gotta, let the market tell you whether you're right or not. Don't sit and guess for years worrying about it.
So I'm going to say this, and I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap it. I think if you're investing other people's money, you need to make sure you get a pretty high stick rate. If you're going into an operation in Iraq, you need to make sure you got a pretty high chance of succeeding. If you're putting out an article, if you're putting out a song, life or death isn't there. You can then turn this into your audience. But you've got to be very, very serious and very, very committed to what it is your outcome is. And if your outcome is to be like Ian, someone who's giving opinions about business and growth and management, he can course correct. For me, with that big deal, the 75 unit deal, we knew that there was going to be ups and there was going to be downs, but overall it was a good body of work. So I think you have to understand where can you be cavalier and where can you not. But the goal of this entire podcast is do not cripple yourself with fear and procrastination where you can do nothing.
The way I'm going to wrap this, Frank, and it's really good lead in, this podcast is a very good example of everything that we're talking about. If Frank and I could have gone out and hired camera crews and perfect lighting, and we could be in a studio only when we do this to make it appear like we're Joe Rogan. We're not. We're a couple of guys that have some decent ideas that we want to share. And Frank has his microphone sitting on 2 architecture books just to get it close enough to his mouth right now. Our lighting isn't perfect. If you look at our background, we have a half a piece of art. I think anyone who does a podcast would probably poke holes all over this thing. But both of us said, let's have fun. Our goal is not to make money. Our goal is to put some things out. Let's test it. Let's see if anyone wants to watch it. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe in 5 years, we look back at these first ones where we're using free Zoom software to put it together. And my guy, Sanisha, over in Bosnia is editing these things for $100 a pop. Maybe we'll look back at it and say, man, that's pretty wild how low budget we were in the beginning. Or maybe it's still the same, but nothing's changing about our content. And if we don't put it out, we won't know whether it was worth doing it. And we're having a blast doing it. So I think this podcast is a perfect example of done is the new perfect. We do pay attention. We do prepare for these things, but we're not over preparing to where we're never going to produce a freaking podcast.
That's it.
Well, that's a great wrap up, Frank. Thank you very much. You're not the best color man in the business for nothing, Frankie.
For nothing, folks.
Oh man. All right. Go get some stuff done. Don't be perfect today, brother.
All right, buddy. Let's get this done.
All right, man. See you.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.